I'd say that Europe is in no position right now to assure its own defense, and that's been a long time coming.
You open with the European Union announcing 800 billion for rearmament. Why isn't this, in your view, a turning point?
The reason it's not a turning point is because it's a drop in the ocean compared to what's needed. If you look a little bit beneath the surface, you realize you can't just build up a military like that. In many ways, some people have argued that there was no Ukrainian national identity until Putin invaded, and actually in some ways Putin helped create that identity. That's a remarkable thing, but it's an important thing because ultimately national security depends on your nation, on the people, not just experts, not just kit, but the will of your people. You get these very low percentages of Gen Z saying that they're willing to fight. I think what they're really saying is they're not willing to fight for you.
Hello, and welcome to MCC Brussels Deep Dive Podcast, where we take a deeper look at the important issues of the day. I am John O'Brien, Head of Communications here at MCC Brussels. Let's talk about how prepared militarily Europe is. Over the past year, Europe has been flooded with declarations, strategies, summits, and roadmaps. And now, of course, an eye-watering figure, 800 billion for rearmament. The message from Brussels is clear. Europe is entering a new era, one defined by urgency, danger, and hard security. But that raises an uncomfortable question. Are we actually becoming safer or just becoming busier? A new report written by Professor Bill Durodié for MCC Brussels, titled A 21st Century Maginot Line, argues that the European Union may be making a familiar mistake, investing heavily in processes, procurement, paper promises, while failing to confront the deeper realities of modern conflict, from innovation capacity to cohesion, to something even more fundamental, purpose, loyalty, and the willingness of citizens to defend what they belong to. Let's get into it. Bill Durodié, thank you for joining us. If you had to summarize the report in one sentence for a non-expert listener, what is it that you'd say?
I'd say that Europe is in no position right now to assure its own defense. And that's been a long time coming, living on the back of the United States, securing its security for it. There's a number of reasons for that. The European Union focuses too much on rules and regulations. When European leaders talk about defense and say they're going to put troops in particular places, a lot of that is what I would call gesture politics, to be seen to be doing the right thing by their people. But they don't actually have a military large enough to do what they say they're going to do. And finally, and possibly most importantly, I don't think there's the will there amongst young people to fight for a nation state that they simply don't believe in, and that for so long spent most of its time telling them that their ideas are wrong about how government should be organized and marginalizing them.
The title of your report, A 21st Century Maginot Line. What's the modern Maginot Line that you think Europe is building?
Well, for those of us who know a little bit about the Maginot Line, it was a series of pretty impressive fortifications built by the French in the 1930s because of their experience of having been invaded by the Germans fairly systematically in the 1870s and again at the First World War. And this included underground tunnels that tanks could drive down, lifts for raising them up to the surface. It covered most of the French border with Germany, apart from Belgium, which the British Expeditionary Force were charged with protecting. But the point is that despite all the expense and despite all the technology, what they hadn't allowed for was changes in technology and, above all, changes in strategy. The Germans came through the Ardennes in what could be considered one of the first maneuverist warfare techniques in history, where they kind of outflanked the entire French defense system. And it should serve as a reminder that no matter how much money you pour into something, you've also got to be ahead of the game. And the French were basically using 1920s, 1930s technology to try and defend themselves into the future. And my parallel, if you like, is that that's in many ways what the European Union is unfortunately looking like it's about to repeat today.
You open with the European Union announcing 800 billion for rearmament. Why isn't this, in your view, a turning point?
It's a turning point in terms of announcements, and it shows you that they can no longer hide if they want to have a defended and secure European Union, there is going to have to be some investment. The reason it's not a turning point is because it's a drop in the ocean compared to what's needed. If you look a little bit beneath the surface, you realize you can't just build up a military like that. It requires what's called a defense industrial base. Well, in terms of Europe, an industrial base in the first place would be a good thing to have. And we know from the Draghi report that preceded all of this from last year, an examination at how poor Europe has become in terms of just industry and business compared to the United States and China.
You write that the European Union has answered how much, but not on what. What's missing from the EU's spending logic?
An understanding that, as I said, you can't just instantly turn it around. So even if you look at the sort of expenditure they're talking about, satellites, let's say, and we're in a period where it's quite remarkable, actually, that, the United Kingdom only launched its first spy satellites, for want of a better word, a couple of years ago. The European system, IRIS-2, is only going to become operational by 2030, if we're lucky. The German system, which is a radar system, called SAR, is being phased out and replaced with a new system that's also not going to be operational for a while. But behind all of that, you then ask the question about who launches these satellites. And it's Elon Musk. Or it's not entirely European. And then you look at who assures the integrity of the cables, and that's still the United States. Whose software are you using? Whose cybersecurity systems are you using? And again and again and again, it's Microsoft, or Starlink, or we could go through the usual American Silicon Valley companies that are doing all of this. Now, just this week, Emmanuel Macron announced that the French will no longer be using Zoom and Teams at government level. But that, first of all, what he's proposing is a long way from coming into place, and will still be using American infrastructure to operate.
What do you think is the biggest illusion in the Commission's Defence Readiness Roadmap 2030?
Their biggest illusion, I suspect, is that people will fight for them. You can double your defense spending, and let's not be under any illusions here, and give credit where it's due. 800 billion from the European Union, but also all of the nation states have announced big improvements of their own. So Friedrich Merz in Germany has announced 377 billion of national spend on defense, about 80 million of which will go to Rheinmetall, their big company in Düsseldorf, I believe. But even if you double or treble your expenses, still people have to operate the kit. People have to man the kit. People have to believe in you to fight for you. And it's a lesson that comes from almost every war, that it doesn't matter how well equipped you are. It's handy to be well equipped. But ultimately, if you don't have a fighting spirit, a belief in what you're fighting for, that's what's going to let you down. And that's been known for a long time. You can read Clausewitz's On War, and in that he describes how it's absolutely imperative for those on the front line to know that the people at home have got their backs and believe in the values that they're demonstrating.
The roadmap proposes 4 flagship initiatives: the drone defense, the Eastern Flank Watch, the Air Shield, the Space Shield. Which of these is the most plausible, and which is the most Brussels fantasy?
Ooh, I don't know. Possibly the most plausible is the air shield, oddly enough. The Germans have volunteered to lead on that. And, because Europe has an air engineering expertise with Airbus and various other companies. I think the drones, it's the classic too late in the day to assume that you're going to get anywhere quickly. I mean, drone warfare in Ukraine, which kind of triggered all of this, because it was when Europe realized that America wasn't necessarily going to share all their intelligence about Ukraine anymore, that suddenly the Europeans woke up. We're going to have to do something here. But what you see in Ukraine is how fast technology advances when there's a practical imperative. So very early on, the Russians realized we're going to have to replace the materials we use to make drones, because if materials are detectable, then that undermines the purpose. And then the Ukrainians realized you can't use radio telemetry to guide systems because the signal gives away where you are. And so people have started using fiber optic technology, or even pre-programming drones, or famously in the case of the Ukrainians, of course, sending them to Russia in a truck that then opens up and launches right next to an airbase. But the point I'm making is that the technology advances very, very rapidly when there's a need for it. Europe is proposing trying to catch up. It may catch up, but you're basically going to catch up with what exists. And what you really need is what's coming next.
The Commission calls itself a facilitator and insists member states remain sovereign. Is that genuine humility, or is it bureaucratic positioning?
I think they said it because they sense the mood of the times is towards more state-oriented political parties, the rise of populism at home, and it's more to be seen to be appealing to that audience. But if you read a bit beyond that in the document, the Defense Readiness Roadmap, you'll see that it's Kaja Kallas, the lead commissioner for foreign and security policy, who still decides whether what nation states propose fits into the collective agenda. So you can see that they still want to control things.
Now, one of your strongest lines, I thought, was essentially EU officials produce jargon, they don't deliver. What's your best evidence for that claim in defense specifically?
Well, Europe as a whole has been discussing having a European army, a European military, a European defense force, you name it, for almost as long as the European project has been around.
Right.
And nothing's ever come of it for a variety of reasons, usually mistrust from particular nation states against others. The reality is that when push comes to shove, when, Europe's very good at dealing with mundane things like regulating chemicals, things that most ordinary people fall asleep when they hear about in polite conversation. But whenever there's been a crisis in Europe, nation states have gone their own way. You can go back to the 2008 financial crisis, and most of the national banks decided to go their own way. You can look at COVID, absolutely, when the French and the Germans announced that personal protective equipment would be embargoed, so thereby breaking European Union trade rules. And the moment the Ukraine war started, you saw that some people were kind of a little bit more sympathetic to Russia, others absolutely not, like Poland, and others a bit embarrassed, actually, at how their own companies were breaking the sanctions that were being imposed. I recall reading an article about in excess of 90 Dutch companies were breaking the embargoes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, your reference to the Draghi competitiveness report and the productivity gap driven by digital tech, is Europe's defense weakness ultimately a tech weakness?
Tech weakness is one of them. And, we shouldn't never forget that the top 10 tech companies in the world, I think there's only one European company that features, which is Mistral, a French company who, by the way, are looking to relocate in Palo Alto, California. Where else? Because you can't get venture capital delivered quickly in Europe. So that's
telling. That's very telling.
Absolutely. So you realize that tech also combines with finance and an appetite for risk taking. Because when you look at Palo Alto, what you have is venture capitalists prepared to just give away millions or more, knowing that they stand a high chance of never seeing a return at all. They just hope that, maybe 1 in 10 of their investments will deliver. That doesn't exist in Europe. It's also the rules and regulations. I mean, since these announcements of 800 billions of spending, companies in Sweden who, for instance, make a lot of ballistics have tried to expand and then encountered a huge hurdle, which is environmental regulation in Europe, which means they can't without doing an environmental impact assessment. And to be honest, a company like Swebal, Swedish Ballistics, have given up on certain projects because there's too much. Rheinmetall, who I mentioned a bit earlier, they've got a subsidiary in Italy. I think it's in Sardinia, where the local mayor has said they don't want any expansion because they think social investment is a priority, not going down a defense route. So you've got all of these barriers. And then on top of which, I think, is the kind of, the reluctance of young people to buy into any of this.
The report argues there's a difference between regulating and leading. What does the EU do that looks like leadership, but is actually just regulation?
Well, I suppose the big one is when Keir Starmer, who obviously is not an EU leader, but, met with Emmanuel Macron and I think 18 heads of state from the EU, as well as the Director General of NATO. And then they came out and made an announcement of a kind of coalition of the willing who were going to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. Now, the reality is, because my next project is looking at the plausibility of troops on the ground from European armed forces. And there's kind of well-known figure that the British Army or the British military have gone down from a total size of about 180,000 to 110,000 in the last decade, which is a pretty dramatic drop. But when you drill down into that 110,000, which is a size that most people joke about fitting in Wembley Stadium, but of that 110,000, a large proportion of it is logistics, catering, all sorts of things that you forget about are necessary for fighting war. But less than 20,000 are trained in combat and fit to deploy at any one time. Now, the announcement from Macron and Starmer was that they were going to put 15,000 into Ukraine, 15,000 to monitor a 1,200-kilometer frontier with Belarus and Russia is implausible for countries that can't even defend their own borders from immigrants in boats. And it's just, you can see at that point that these are grandiose announcements that are never going to be fulfilled in practice.
Now, a lot of conversation in the last couple of years about the US relationship with Europe. If Europe can't compete with Starlink type systems or the US cloud infrastructure, what does strategic autonomy realistically mean?
I think the starting point has to be national governments going back to their people, reconnecting with their people for the first time in a long time. Because if you think about it, a lot of the European project has been about divorcing decision-making from the people. There is no European identity that people would feel a strong sense of loyalty to. Who's going to say, I'm going to fight for Ursula von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas? Of course, the problem is deeper than that. No one's going to fight for Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, or Friedrich Merz either. But it's necessary to go back to your people and win their hearts and loyalties to a national project. And then once you have that, once you establish a degree of confidence in where the country, the nation is going, and on the basis that people are now re-engaged with the political process in their own countries, I think then it's possible to look at rebuilding alliances. That is a long-term project. I don't want to sit here and make it sound like there's nothing Europe can do and there's no point even trying. But we have to be realistic of where you have to start. There are several elements to that. One is rebuilding an industrial base, which has fallen apart. And that will mean pulling away rules and regulations that have prevented that or stifled that from developing.
What's the number one lesson? You say that Brussels can learn from Ukraine. What's the number one lesson that Ukraine teaches that the EU is continuing to ignore?
Well, let's never forget that when the Russians invaded Ukraine, most serious voices in the West, even in the United States, thought that at best Zelensky would last 48, maybe 72 hours.
Yep.
The reality was completely different. And Zelensky famously said he doesn't need an airplane to lift him out, he needs ammunition. And his willingness to put his own neck on the line, but above all, the willingness of ordinary citizens in Ukraine to support that decision was quite remarkable. I mean, academic professors like myself, ballerinas, florists, all manner of people said, actually, we're going to stop what we're doing now, and we're either going to go to the front line or we're going to help in the defense effort in some way. That's quite remarkable. In many ways, some people have argued that there was no Ukrainian national identity until Putin invaded. And actually, in some ways, Putin helped create that identity. That's a remarkable thing, but it's an important thing because ultimately national security depends on your nation, on the people. And that's the building block of security, not just experts trained to deliver, not just kit of whatever standard and level, but the will of your people.
Now, Ukraine built capacity through necessity and improvisation. Can a wealthy bureaucracy replicate wartime decision-making? Or is that impossible by definition, that unless you're in the circumstance, you can't imagine what you're going to need?
Well, it's not for no reason that there's a saying that necessity is the mother of invention. And it's true that, it's when people are involved in practical projects that things accelerate. You can go throughout history to see that. It's when European nations were navigating the globe that it led to the invention of technologies that helped them do that, including a chronometer that worked at sea, including the development of maps. And so it's always harder for a bureaucracy that's comfortable and sitting in an office to give that impetus. But I think there are things that can be done to at least try and strip away some of the rules that hold you back. And most strikingly, I think, is all the digital rules that the European Union has put in place over the last few years. The Digital Sovereignty Act, the digital safeguarding. All of these things make the European Union very good at regulating the technology of others, but absolutely hopeless at innovating technology of its own.
You talk of European troops in Ukraine as gesture politics. What makes it gesture rather than a strategy?
Oh, well, this announcement, as I recall, was made in February of last year. So we're almost a year, maybe a bit less. Nothing's happened since. So first of all, it's quite patently a gesture. And it goes beyond that. I think the Belgian Prime Minister, Theo Franken, made a ridiculous announcement that, we would destroy Moscow. We don't need that kind of really, frankly, undiplomatic, puerile and almost childish language. What we need is people who are serious and understand the problem, and who understand that the problem begins at home. That, like Keir Starmer would be well advised, as every other European Union leader, to stop navigating the globe, making fancy announcement for camera opportunities, and going back to their people on a cold, rainy Thursday night in February, well, March, where people have lost their jobs in some factory, and trying to work out how do you reconnect with these people and their aspirations? Because if you don't have that, you've got nothing.
If Europe can only muster 15,000 troops when 100,000 might be required, what does that tell us about European military readiness?
Well, it tells you that we're not ready. They can actually muster more than 15,000.
Okay.
But as I was just reading yesterday, I think in one of the last military exercises for NATO, which I think was meant to last 20 days, but don't quote me on that, although obviously I'm on record, the British ammunition ran out within 12 days. So, it's basic things in supply chains, in production of ammunition, in, and technological problems in procurement of new technologies. It's simply not there. Very, very basic things. Europe is not ready. And also quite strikingly, if you look at the reason people have dropped out of the military over the last 10 years, it's changed from musculoskeletal complaints a decade ago, so people being pushed too hard or hurting themselves while on training exercises, to increasingly mental and behavioral problems today. And that tells you that there's kind of an attitudinal shift that is actually hampering our own military.
You argue in your report that the real deficit isn't money or procurement, it's loyalty. What do you think European elites struggle with to speak that language?
They don't trust the people.
Mm-hmm.
They don't trust the people. And we see that, particularly in Europe, actually, with famously the so-called cordon sanitaire, where European parties, all on the decline from the left, the Greens, the Liberals, fear the emergence of what they call far-right populist groups. But they're not really far-right. They're just slightly conservative or slightly to the right of what they like. And because of their concerns about the AfD in Germany or Marine Le Pen in France, they have done a deal amongst themselves to not allow these parties ever to have a say or to control things. So even when a right-wing populist party nominally wins an election by having the majority vote, even because it's not a majority large enough to control things, all the other parties club together to stop them from doing that. Now, that makes no sense because liberals, the left, the far left and Greens don't see eye to eye on anything, really. I mean, you can just see the kind of chaos in the kind of green politics about, for example, on the one hand supporting Palestine and on the other supporting transgender identity. These things don't match because Islamists, trust me, don't support transgender identity. And so you're on a hiding to nothing. You're creating alliances that are doomed to collapse.
You have written before, and we've talked before, about the low willingness among Gen Z to fight. Is that a cultural crisis? Is it an educational one? Is it a legitimacy crisis that they don't believe in what they to fight for?
I think ultimately young people today are probably no different to young people in any generation. They're energetic, curious, wanting to push at doors that they sense are closed. The only difference today is actually the people at the top. The doors collapse very easily when young people push against them, whereas maybe a generation or two ago, those in authority would have said, well, it's good of you to challenge, but actually this is the way things are. Whereas there's a reluctance to say this is the way things are today, because I suspect the people at the top, A, don't know the way things are, B, don't believe in what they're held to believe in. And the consequence of that is you get these very low percentages of Gen Z saying that they're willing to fight. I think what they're really saying is they're not willing to fight for you. I don't know that they're not willing to fight ultimately. And they're going to have to find and define their own path into the future now. I think there's a limit to how much we can say from experience about what they need to do. And I think, unfortunately, they've been almost educated in schools to not trust their own governments. They've been told that, nation states are racist, colonialist, and why would you fight for that? I'm sympathetic to their reluctance. But of course, they will ultimately have to challenge things.
Professor Bill Durodié, thank you for writing this report, and thank you for coming in today to talk to us about it.
Thank you.
That was a fascinating conversation, and a sobering one, because whatever you think of Brussels' latest defence ambitions, one thing is clear. This isn't simply a debate about procurement or budgets or institutional competence. It's a debate about something far deeper. Whether Europe still has the cohesion, confidence, and clarity of purpose needed to defend itself in a world that has become harsher, faster, and far less forgiving. If you've enjoyed this deep dive, please do subscribe, do share the episode, and if you'd like to read the full report, you can find it on the MCC Brussels website. A link is in the comments below. Oh, and please, leave a comment. We are always interested in what you, the viewers and listeners, have to say and what you think. My thanks again to today's guest, Bill Durodié, and to you for listening. I'm John O'Brien, Head of Communications at MCC Brussels, signing off. Until next time.